It is my pleasure to introduce the next panel discussion to you. My name is Leonie, I'm the program director of the forum, and I will give you a couple of numbers as a food for thought for the panelists. We ask each year for the Berlin Pulse, our main foreign policy publication, what Germans think, what are the greatest foreign challenges German foreign policy is facing. And I can tell you already now, we have a new #1 challenge this year. You see the results on the screen. For the first time, climate and environment has become the #1 challenge for Germans. It has increased from 5 to 31%. I think that is very clear and demonstrates very clearly that climate change is one of the main and most urgent test cases for multilateralism. I would also like to add a quote, or a more skeptical quote, from an author of the Berlin Pulse, Tom White from the Brookings Institution, who asked, what exactly does Germany actually mean when Germany speaks of multilateralism? Is it a value-based approach of the like-minded, or is it just a convening project to bring everyone together? These questions will be discussed on the next panel together with Minister Søreide. It is my pleasure to welcome Jan Eliasson, former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and Chair of SIPRI, Nils Schmid, Spokesperson on Foreign Affairs of the SPD Parliamentary Group. We have with us Kori, Deputy Director General of IISS, and this will be followed by an intervention by Leonie Bremer. She's a spokesperson, Fridays for Future in Germany, on the climate crisis. The discussion will be moderated by Tina Hassel, head of the ARD Berlin studio. And just a short logistical remark, we will do the coffee break a little bit later so that we have enough time for the discussion. And please use the coffee break later to register for the breakout sessions if you haven't done so. Follow the discussion with the hashtag Berlin Forum. Ask your questions via Twitter if you want so. And now, please, the panelists, welcome on stage.
Ich glaube, es muss noch. Okay, it's all good. So, don't preach the converted could be a nice and fitting headline for this panel. As we have already heard during the two opening discussions, I think everyone here in this panel and in the audience does consider himself as multilateralist, and I think no one here, neither on the panel nor in the audience, will actually question the rule-based international order. So we have to discuss right here what can we do to protect and strengthen this order, and I hope, as you mentioned, we can put some beef into these discussions, and I mean, will be as concrete as possible about what can we do and what should be our priorities to do so. So I'm very happy to discuss those important but difficult questions with my distinguished panel, and I would love to start with you, Ina Eriksen Søreide, as you gave a little already tour d'horizon about all the challenges we are facing. You said there is an increasing trend of bypassing this system, and that we have to kind of prioritize our actions. So mention the White Book. What is your priority? What are your priorities to go against that trend? Because we just can't reverse the shifting of powers you mentioned.
Well, when we talk about prioritizing, and as you opened also with about preaching to the converted, I think sometimes we also have to preach to the converted, because we need to actually be aware of how challenging this situation is. What we have been doing is to both initiate but also to join partnerships where this is absolutely relevant. One example is that we are participating in the Ottawa group of 13 WTO members who are trying to find solutions to some of the more, I would say, pressing but also difficult issues to reform the WTO. One being, as I briefly mentioned, the balance between developing and developed countries, because you can categorize yourself, meaning that China is a developing country in the WTO, which of course is felt quite unfair by many others. And we still are discussing issues from the Doha round in 2001 in the WTO, and we're now in 2019. So there is an urgent need to do something, and I think that we are now in a situation where we cannot just sit and wait for everything to be dealt with from the top. We have to start some initiatives. A second thing with the WTO is that we are joining initiatives that are not always multilateral, but plurilateral, meaning that if enough countries or enough members want to join, then that's a starting point, keeping it open for everyone else to join in later on. A third example is how we are now joining Nordic forces with the Nordic African initiative to try to strengthen multilateralism going on to the UN's 75th anniversary next year. So we have initiated that because we know that it is extremely important to engage not only our geographically closest friends and allies, which we of course find on this continent, but also to reach out to others to make sure that multilateralism, which is widely regarded as the best way of organizing this world, also has a chance of surviving.
Kori, Schake, you are American, you are a member of the Republican Party. So let me ask you the question, to what extent America First is the opposite of what we, I think, all understand as the concept of joint efforts to problems. So to what extent this current administration is still a reliable partner in upholding those values we are talking right now?
It's a difficult question for an American to answer.
Sorry.
But
Sound.
it is...
Sound.
Not the sound.
Difficult.
Yeah.
It's not on.
It's fine.
Can't do anything about it, my friends. It's a difficult question for an American to answer, and because the president is in fact destructive to the international order, and we see a lot of countries worried about it, not just our European friends worried about it. But I would offer two counter notes. The first is that one of the really great things about the United States of America is how many things are out of the power of the President of the United States to affect. And I would just point out to you that the first country that is going to reach its Paris Climate Accord goals is the United States of America, thanks to the good work of the governor of California and Mike Bloomberg's money and civil society, and my mom wanting to make brave choices in order to keep the world safe for her grandchildren. So the first thing is the President of the United States isn't the only vote that matters in the United States. And the second thing I would say is that at a time in which the president is reckless and erratic, I think you see a lot of counterbalancing forces, even in the American government. As we are currently enduring the impeachment hearings in the House, it matters to realize that the United States Defense Department still is making the case internally and externally for greater American engagement, that you see all sorts of stabilizing forces in the system. Civil society, one of the first pieces of legislation that the current Congress passed after the 2018 elections was denying the President of the United States money to draw down American forces in Europe or Asia. So there are a lot of counterbalancing forces in the American system. And while I thank America's allies for your patience as we have yet another boisterous discussion in American democracy, it's also true that the forces of engagement are strengthening in American public attitudes. And let me just quickly give you two data points, both from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs annual survey of American attitudes. The first is that the NATO country in which the highest proportion of the public are willing to go to war to defend an ally, the highest proportion is in the United States of America. And the second important piece of data from the Chicago Council's polls is that the biggest swing they have seen ever in changing public attitudes in the United States has been and move in the last 3 years in opposition to the president's attitudes about America's allies. You've seen a greater than 15-point shift in the American public attitude in favor of greater allied engagement.
Thanks, Kori, for those informations and insight. Nils Schmid, earlier Heiko Maas already mentioned the Alliance for Multilateralism, hashtag Materialism Matters. More than 50 countries already joined that network, but what exactly does it aim for, and what are the concrete actions, not only goals, but actions that this alliance can deliver?
First, there's good news. It's even more than 60 countries now that have joined
even better, yeah.
This alliance. And the leading principle behind this concept is not to create new multilateral institutions, but to strengthen the existing ones, be it the global institutions like WTO and especially the United Nations system, be it the European Union or NATO. And I believe that there are 3 institutions that are most dear to our hearts and which are very important to our German national interest. That is the European Union, the UN, and NATO, for different reasons. And so I believe that we should focus on our work within the framework of this alliance to strengthen and, if necessary, reform these multilateral organizations, the EU being by far the most important to Germany, because without a strong EU, there cannot be any effective German foreign policy, be it on the European level, be it on the global level. And so the best example of how successful multilateralism works is indeed the European Union.
Before we come to the UN and to you, Jan Eliasson, just allow me one question. I mean, the future president of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, shortly delivered a speech, and she said that Europe has to learn the language of power, because soft power only doesn't work anymore in that new political environment. So if you mention the EU, and we do know all the shortcomings of the EU so far, what would be the right muscle to develop? What does she mean? What would you say to that?
First, I would like to elaborate on a sort of counter-narrative to that, because especially in the field of foreign policy, the EU has been extremely successful in the last few years. So just look at Brexit, which is, of course, a very negative event forced upon us in a way, but still the united EU front holds, especially with respect to the very particular interest of a rather small member of the European Union, the Republic of Ireland. So we are all standing behind Ireland in this context. Or take the JCPOA. One great success story of European diplomacy. First the E3, but then supported by the whole of the European Union. And so I believe that there are some examples showing the potential of EU action in the field of foreign policy. Yes, we have to do more, we have to be better, and we have to use our leverage more wisely, and we should not underestimate the soft power leverage we have. For example, there's one leverage which is not so much in the focus of public attention and media attention. That is the normative power, the regulatory power of the European Union. So there's a lot of talk about bureaucracy in Brussels and the cumbersome regulation coming out of the European Union, but in fact, these laws are taken over by many countries all around the world because it just works. It gives prosperity and employment to the European Union. That's why other countries, for example, in the post-Soviet space, are eager to take over this type of regulation. So Yes.
seem very quite satisfied.
But I don't like this discourse of saying, oh, the European Union is so bad. We are strong and we should be more...
I agree with Ursula von der Leyen that Europe has to learn more the language of power.
I agree in general terms, but the question is, what does it mean exactly? And I'm keen to learn more about that. We'll see. What she's up to. But still, we should not focus only on military power. We need to develop military power and we need to strengthen the European pillar within NATO. But I don't like this kind of debate, hey, the sole measurement that really counts is military engagement.
No,
this is that's not how we fancy our foreign policy.
Thank you. So let's talk about maybe the most important multilateralism institution about the UN. John Eliasson, you as a long-time Vice UN Secretary General, you know how important the UN is, but you certainly do know already that quite often Security Council is stuck and therefore the UN is unable to deliver real solutions on important crisis. So what is, in your opinion, the most important reform from UN to make that work again or better?
Well, first of all, I think you should have a less complicated word than multilateralism when you talk about the importance of this work. Because if 67% of the German people don't understand it, I think we have a huge communication problem.
Absolutely.
I think you should put it like home alone, or be together in the world should be the choice. And you would probably hopefully you would have reverse figures after that. Well, as Ines said in her introduction, United Nations is a mirror, a reflection of two things. It's a reflection of the world as it is, and it's not a pretty place, and it's a reflection of what the world should be. And we need to keep both perspectives. We need to have a very cool-headed analysis of this troubled world, no illusions. It's a tough job, but we must never forget the direction to go, the principles on which the order was established after the horror period 1930-1945. I have always, still, even if I've retired from the UN and Swedish government, the UN Charter in my pocket.
Very good.
Do you know the first three words in this charter? It's not we the government, it's we the peoples. We the peoples. If we lose a connection to the fact that we are here to improve the situation on the ground for people, then we have lost the soul of what international cooperation is all about.
Therefore, now, we do need the reforms.
Yes, and I'm going to go to the...
What would be your priority?
Yes, over to the beef. Over to the beef. The beef is...
Waiting for it.
The beef is one of the most concrete things, and I can say it now, much more relaxed than when I was Deputy Secretary General. My biggest frustration during my 5 years in the UN and the leadership was, of course, the war in Syria. It was just horrible on the ground, different forces. It was proxy war. Countries in the region locked the different solutions, that they interfered widely in the area. For instance, there is a tension between Iran and Saudi that translates into that conflict. Turkey has their own interest. And thirdly, in the Council, where I was presenting the Syria crisis together with Kofi Annan, Lakhdar Brahimi, Staffan de Mistura, US and Russia were on two sides. So we didn't get any resolution. And the UN Security Council will be UN will be as strong as the member states want it to be. Now, my proposal.
Here we go.
My proposal is that every time a veto is cast, or the threat of the veto is expressed, we in the world should consider this a huge failure or even bad taste. The Security Council should turn into a real negotiation body. We are not yet back at the Cold War period up until 1989. Unfortunately, there are trends in that direction, but we can negotiate, as we did, I remember, in the early 90s. The Council could be a negotiation body, and they should have as a duty to come out with a resolution in a negotiation.
No veto.
No veto. And I will bring this to a more or less serious comparison. I think the Security Council should work like the Catholic Church when they select popes.
Oh.
They should be sitting in a room and only when the white smoke comes out and the resolution is there, we would have a tool in our hand. So the savior for my sanity, because of this horrible Syria war for all the time I was there, is that something good happened 2015, which I really think you should be aware of. We had the agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, which is really a toolbox to repair the world. Johan Rockström, a Swedish climate scientist, calls it a survival kit for humanity. These goals are really connected to both human rights and to peace.
And this is a wonderful bridge to what we want to include one more to this panel, Leonie Bremer from Fridays for Future, because sustainability and climate change are the #1 priority. Foreign Minister Maas called climate change the new imperative of foreign policy. And so, Leonie, I think we are having a short discussion over there before you have to leave. And I think before we start some Q&A, you want to have a small speech.
Yeah. Thank you. 3 days ago, I received a text message from Australia. My eyes are burning and I have to cough. People wear air masks and the fire department sirens are constantly yelling. This is a harmless example. When you are talking about climate change, you primarily focus on the environmental issue. This is missing a critical component: people. My generation is the generation of freedom. This is what they taught me in kindergarten, school, and university. I have infinite possibilities all over the world, they said. This is lie #1. Already at 22, the climate crisis is a vicious cycle, taking control of my life in every aspect. 3 weeks ago, 11,000 scientists declared my future as a time of untold suffering. But yet, it has not killed me. Yet the climate crisis is already killing others in countries in the global south that are least responsible but suffer the most. 250,000 additional deaths per year are expected between 2030 and 2050, according to the World Health Organization. Multilateralism is based on the principle that we all have the same needs. Needs that can be covered by keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. Therefore, we need foreign policy, and here's why. Climate change, by definition, does not allow borders, and multilateralism should manage cross-border problems collectively. Consequently, the climate crisis can only be solved by multilateral action. Our planet can only tolerate additional 320 gigatons of CO2 emissions. Exceeding this limit activates irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. Chain reactions that result in food shortage, water shortage, displacement of 100 million people due to sea level rise, and make areas around the equator uninhabitable. This is my future prospect, a future of untold suffering. Foreign policy has the power to avert these severe climate change consequences. Foreign policy has the power to affect the largest number of people. You can obtain huge transitions through multilateralism. Heiko Maas mentioned at his Foreign Office on the 15th of November that the German climate package was a sign of transition for many countries, that it has power. This is lie number 2. According to the Federal Audit Office, our climate package is bureaucratic, socially unjust, and fails all climate change goals. German politicians celebrate themselves for empty words. But at the same time, they aim for a stronger foreign policy. For me, this is odd logic. This is not how to obtain huge transitions. So I ask you to not misuse your tremendous power. You need to strengthen multilateralism for climate justice. The climate emergency has to be the priority of every decision you make. Just talking about climate crisis doesn't help. Nodding doesn't help. A little bit of climate protection is no climate protection. We cannot save a burning planet with a cup of water. Countries like Germany pretend to be far developed. But here is the fun fact. Germany starts running a new coal power plant next year. And yes, there are cheaper and greener technologies available already. Unfortunately, this is not a lie. To all emerging countries, do better, skip the process of failure, skip the excess emissions. There's no modern economy without climate protection. You just have to be willing to move forward. Foreign policy has the transformational power to tackle climate crisis and to activate climate justice, to achieve climate justice. But as long as you don't act, I will be there. As long as you understand freedom as freedom of the industry, I stand up for freedom of people. The next global strike is this Friday. Also, I will be at COP25 to watch you. I don't want your applause or praise. I want you to stop lying. This you should have learned as a child. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Leonie. Bremer, Fridays for Future German spokesperson, and that's what Fridays for Future is for. I mean, to say to all those, us, to everyone here, too little, too late, but still, I mean, do you see any shifting, any wake-up call, more action, and who are the partners you see for your movement? Because, for example, the new European Commission is going for a Green Deal. So could they be partners?
I see that no country in the world has met the Paris Agreement goals so far. And so I right now see no partner because they are just all talking about climate crisis. We never had the intention to go on the streets that people are talking about that. I see a partner when I saw action, then I can consider that there is a partner.
And is it a lack of agreement or the lack of the willing to implement those in your perspective?
There's a lack for the opportunity to implement things, therefore we need rules that are missing. And yeah, of course, there's also the problem that we are not willing to move forward, as I said already. I don't know if there are personal advantages that some politicians have to, for example, have the new rule for wind power plants to have the certain distance to other houses. So I see that there's, of course, personal interest as well, a big problem here.
Thank you, Leonie Bremer. Thank you for your input. And let's bring it to the panel. Let's bring it to the panel. And as you were all mentioned in this appel, so who wants to answer and maybe give some light or some positive?
Well, I think, first of all, it's great that we start not only to work as we should for young people, and we need to do much more for young people, also in the rich and prosperous countries, but also what's important is that we work with young people. Mm-hmm. I'm from the country of Greta, and she has become world renowned in 1 year. and she pushed a button which reminded us all that this existential issue is within our minds and souls and hearts. And I think it's time that we start a movement which could be called peace with nature. We have for far too long just exploited everything in nature. We need to be in harmony with nature. We have no planet B. We may have plan B, but there is no planet B. And I think this attitude has been strengthened so much by the young people on the streets in the world, in millions. And I think we should be grateful. My only big question that I really don't have a good answer to is, why has this become so politically controversial? Because I think the future of the world and the planet and our children and grandchildren should unite. But I notice in the debate on Twitter and on anything, it's really a very harsh and bitter enmity on these issues, which have to do with survival. So maybe that could be...
Maybe Søreide, you wanted to answer as well, and then we open up the discussion to everyone here, because time is ticking, and I think still have only 10 minutes to go. So maybe just you wanted to add something on that as well.
Well, just very shortly, when I mentioned at the podium our ocean conference that we held in Oslo, a substantial part of that was actually holding a youth panel that went both in parallel and as part of the conference. And I think that it's, and that brings me to the main point. I think that climate change issues cannot be solved without working together globally. And I think that's maybe one of the most important examples of how multilateralism is quite vital to making a change. And not one country, not the US, not Norway, not Germany, not anyone can do things alone. Yes, we can do things, but it will ultimately not change anything unless we do it together. And secondly, as you probably know, we are a candidate for the Security Council in 21 to 22. And one of the issues that we want to put on the agenda that, as I agree with Jan, strangely enough, is very controversial in the Security Council, is the nexus between climate and security. And I think it's absolutely going to be an enormous task in the years that lie ahead to deal with the consequences of climate change and the consequences it has for conflict. It's really, to be honest, a threat multiplier. And the fight for scarce resources, the fact that people are displaced because of natural disasters, of climate change, that is something that we, as an international society, are going to have to deal with.
So as I mentioned, I would love to open up the discussion to everyone. It's not only about climate change, it's about NATO, it's about everything around our important questions. And so I see in the second row over there, maybe the
microphone
first. The mic goes over there, second row.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So
it's my ambassador.
Okay, here we go. Here we go. Thanks.
Just give me timing instructions.
I thank the panel and also Kori Foundation. I'm Qasem Sajjadpour, the president of IISS from Iran. I was impressed by so much emphasis on multilateralism and the concepts, but there is one single issue which really is the determining factor for the future of multilateralism, at least from my regional perspective, that is JCPOA. And what happened to it during the last 2 years. So the question is clear. I hope I get a good answer. Does Europe, I mean, the European actions, are European actions enough to save JCPOA? Or is still too much bureaucratic talks and too much, we support, but the reality on the ground, from ambition to action, nothing is happening for saving JCPOA. What's the response of the panel? Thank you.
Maybe Nils Arden, would you like to answer?
Yeah, you have to broaden the question. Does Iran do enough to preserve the JCPOA? Does Russia do enough? Does China do enough? It's not only about Europe. It's also about all the other partners of the JCPOA. And I believe that we're in a downward spiral right now, and we have to take care not to threaten the JCPOA as a whole. And that's why I'm very much concerned by the recent actions taken by the Iranian government, but I'm also very much engaged in having first deal done by the IISS scheme the Europeans have prepared, and I'm quite confident that we will see one of those deals being passed by the end of this year. So we're going to see some progress on that. You are right. We have to stick to our part of the agreement as well, and one of the advantages Iran was promised was to have more room for trade deals with the world, with partners in the world. So yeah, but it's a multilateral agreement. It's not only about the European Union.
Other questions? Yeah, here we go.
Well, thanks very much, and I would like to thank the German Foreign Ministry for the invitation to participate at this very important forum, and we congratulate Norway and the Minister for aligning Norway with this initiative. I would like to posit a statement and seek the response of the panel that there is a perspective that this alliance for multilateralism should transcend traditional historical ideological divide that has existed in the world, that we should not view this alliance purely from a like-minded prism or from a prism of ideological compatibility. That it's important to bring in some key countries, particularly in the South, at the top of this initiative, to give it universality, a more credibility and legitimacy. And I think, as you know, ironically, the biggest defenders of the system, the most powerful vocal defenders of the system, is China and Russia, particularly China with regards to the global trading system, where the Chinese president has articulated a very principled position on the preservation of the multilateral trading system. And I think it's important that we should engage these countries as well as organized groupings within the UN system, such as the Africa group, which is numerically a big group, the G77, and others, so that this initiative is not seen as a Western initiative.
Thank you.
The last question, I would like to invite your comment on the very important moment next year of the 75th anniversary of the UN. And it's a serious indictment that 75 years later, we've not reformed the UN to reflect the current global realities. What is it that we should do to give new impetus to the reform agenda to make the system to be more fair, more equitable, more balanced and representative?
Thank you for actually those three very challenging questions. Maybe first one, not keep the multinational alliance as just like-minded, an alliance of like-minded, but open it up more. Maybe Kori, you want to add something on that?
Sure. So your point's a good one about broad participation being legitimating. But there is also the legitimation that comes from holding each other accountable to standards. And so I wouldn't want to not have a community of like-minded states who hold each other accountable for our values. I feel the strengthening of that from America's allies right now, so I can speak to the importance of it. I want to say a word about Russia and China, though, because you said that they are the main stalwarts upholding the international order, and that's actually flat not true. Russia's bombing hospitals in Syria. Russia invaded Crimea, the first European violent change of borders since 1945. China is a partial participant in the World Trading Order, but the United States has won all 20 cases it brought against China at the WTO. China's a partial participant in the pieces of the international order they like, and they are not participating in, for example, not threatening their neighbors, not taking territory in the South China Sea, not unilaterally asserting their national sovereignty. So the United States has work to do. All of us have work to do, but it is flat not true that Russia and China are better international citizens.
We are in the middle of a very interesting discussion that we can follow up during coffee break, but I wanted to take the second part of your question, and you were talking about reform of the UN and next year's anniversary. So Germany is part of that small group, the G4 for reforms. We already heard you about skipping the veto maybe, or transforming the veto. What should be, from the German perspective, be the important reform of the UN, as it was mentioned?
Well, there's one practical issue, that's the financing of UN organizations. So we need a steady framework and a continuous financing of these institutions that has to be assured. And then there's the question, what can we do to circumvent the veto and the blockade within the Security Council? So maybe we should bring in the General Assembly more whenever there's a veto or a threat of veto in the Security Council. And there's one last thing, which is not reform of the UN itself, that is strengthening the European role within the UN Security Council. So better coordination between Europeans, be they member of the European Union or not, when they are at the table in the Security Council, is a way of strengthening multilateralism as well.
Thank you. I see other arms rising, but I got that final sign of we have to come to an end. And I mean, of course, these questions we just approached are so huge, and the challenges are so enormous that we, of course, can't just give all the answers in one panel. We all can discuss and continue discussing during coffee break and during the whole other panels following. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your questions.